The sound of footsteps echoed through the palace corridors. Outside, the walls of Jerusalem stood like stone sentinels, witnessing the birth of yet another prince in the line of David. Ahaz came into the world at a time of change. His father, Jotham, was a just king, faithful to the ways of the Lord, but he ruled over a people with divided hearts. Among the streets of Judah, devotion to God competed with the foreign altars that sprang up in hidden alleys and on high hills. Royal blood ran through the boy's veins, but his future was still a mystery shrouded in shadows. From an early age, Ahaz grew up hearing stories about his ancestors. David, the shepherd who became king. Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived. Hezekiah, a name that didn't exist yet but would one day mark a new chapter. However, among all the legends, there were also the murmurs of uncertainty kings who turned away from the God of Israel and reaped tragedy. Judah's fate was always intertwined with the choices of its rulers. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, feel free to support our work with financial aid by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. You can also become a member of the channel and enjoy exclusive benefits. The elders of the palace murmured among themselves, would Ahaz follow in his father's footsteps, walking in the ways of the Lord, or would his soul seek other gods, like some of his predecessors? But time was still in no hurry. The boy grew up between the courtyards of the temple and the halls of the throne, watching, learning, absorbing the weight of a crown that would one day be on his head. But the winds that blew over Judah were not peaceful. To the north, the kingdom of Israel and Syria were plotting something dangerous. Kings were rising up, alliances were being forged, and the fate of little Ahaz was already beginning to be mapped out before he knew it. Because the day would come, sooner than anyone expected, when the prince would become king. And on that day, the choices he would make would change everything. The corridors of the palace no longer seemed the same. The echo of his father Jotham's footsteps had disappeared, and Ahaz now sat on the throne. The day the crown rested on his head was marked by a strange silence, an invisible weight that seemed to crush his shoulders. He had no time for celebration. There was no breathing space between mourning and responsibility. The throne of Judah now belonged to him, but the inheritance he received was not just a kingdom, it was a battlefield. The enemies were already knocking at the door. The news spread like fire through dry straw. The kingdom of Israel and Syria had sealed a pact, a dangerous alliance against Judah. Pekah, king of Israel, and Rezin, king of Syria, were not just hostile neighbors. They wanted to overthrow Ahaz, take Jerusalem, and put a king of their own choosing on the throne. The siege was approaching, and the new king had hardly got used to the weight of the crown. Within the city walls, rumors were spreading. The people looked to the young king for reassurance, but Ahaz did not convey confidence. He knew he wasn't a warrior like David. His heart was racing and his mind was swirling with thoughts. His father had always trusted in the God of Israel, but Ahaz had no such confidence. He had already seen the power of foreign armies, the glitter of Assyrian gold, the strength of the gods of other nations. What if his salvation lay not in heaven, but in the alliances he could make here on earth? He couldn't wait. There was no time for questioning. If he wanted to survive, he had to act. The sound of swords being sharpened echoed through the streets of Jerusalem. The soldiers were preparing, the city walls were on alert, and suspicious eyes were turning towards the palace. The threat was real. The enemy army wasn't just getting organized, it was already marching towards Judah. Ahaz felt time slipping through his fingers like sand. He knew he couldn't face Israel and Syria alone. His soldiers were brave, but there weren't many of them. Jerusalem was strong, but not impenetrable. If Pekah and Rezin took it, his reign would come to an end before it even began. He needed an ally, but not just anyone. He needed someone powerful, someone whose shadow would make even the boldest kings tremble. There was one name everyone feared, Tiglath-Pileser III, king of Assyria. the ruler of a brutal empire, owner of an army that crushed kingdoms like dry leaves in the wind, a man who didn't make alliances but bought loyalty with blood and gold. Ahaz knew that if he went to him, there would be no turning back. But it was either that or lose everything. Without hesitation, he sent messengers with a gift that would make any king stop and listen, silver and gold, taken from the Lord's own temple. Judah's most sacred treasure was now a bargaining chip. But Ahaz didn't care. In the letter he sent to the Assyrian king, he didn't set himself up as an equal. He didn't demand help. He lowered himself, writing in the words of a servant, "I am your servant and your son. Come and deliver me from the hands of the king of Syria and the king of Israel." The messengers left. The gold changed hands. And when the answer came, it didn't come with words. It came with the sound of thousands of marching footsteps. The Assyrian army moved like a storm, devastating everything in its path. But a king like Tiglath-Pileser III doesn't come to anyone's aid without a price. And Ahaz would soon discover that this price would be higher than he had ever imagined. The roar of war rolled across the land like distant thunder. The king of Assyria heard Ahaz's call and responded with brutal force. His troops advanced like a storm over Syria. King Rezin, who had once seemed so powerful, was now nothing more than a cornered prey. Damascus fell before the Assyrian swords. Its walls crumbled, and the blood of its warriors dyed the streets. Rezin himself was killed, his city sacked, and the power of Syria crushed forever. Ahaz received the news like a man who finally lets out a sigh after being submerged for too long. He was safe. The immediate danger had passed. But victory didn't taste as sweet as he imagined. The king of Assyria was no ally. He was a cruel lord who charged every favor with unpayable interest. Judah was now under his rule. The gold that Ahaz had sent as tribute was only the beginning. More taxes, more obedience, more humiliation were to come. And it wasn't just Syria that suffered. Assyria also turned its sights on the kingdom of Israel. Pekah, the king who had joined Rezin against Ahaz, was now tasting his own poison. His cities were attacked, his people captured and taken as slaves to distant lands. Israel was on its knees. Judah was still standing, but by a thread. Ahaz didn't realize that by bowing down to the king of Assyria, he was also beginning to bow down to foreign gods. In his mind, the strength of the Assyrian Empire came not only from its armies, but from the idols they worshipped. And when he had the chance to see with his own eyes what Assyria called sacred, something inside him changed. In Damascus, Ahaz found a different, imposing altar, and there he made a decision that would have consequences that Jerusalem would never forget. The hot wind blew through the ruins of Damascus as Ahaz walked through the wreckage of the conquered city. He should have been relieved to be free of the Syrian threat, but something inside him was restless. His eyes roamed over the desecrated temples, the toppled idols, the altars broken by the fury of the Assyrian army. And then, in the midst of the destruction, he saw something that caught his eye. The structure of an altar, unlike anything that had ever existed in Judah. It was imposing, carved from dark stone, a symbol of power and devotion to foreign gods. He stopped in front of that altar, watching the pagan priests burning offerings, smelling the smoke rising into the sky. The Assyrians were the strongest nation on earth. Their army was feared, their walls were insurmountable. What if their strength came not only from their swords, but also from their gods? Ahaz had never had a firm faith in the God of Israel. Now, as he saw with his own eyes the glory of Assyria, an idea took hold of his mind. If he wanted a strong kingdom, he should follow the example of the most powerful. He ordered his priest Uriah to copy the details of that altar and build it in Jerusalem. It didn't matter that it was different from what God had commanded for the temple. It didn't matter that his ancestors had never bowed down to foreign gods. Ahaz wanted what Assyria had, and he was willing to pay any price. When he returned to Judah, the work was already done. The altar of the Lord was pushed aside, relegated to the background. The new altar dominated the sacred space, and with it came new sacrifices, new rituals, new gods. Ahaz plunged Judah into idolatry like never before, but he had not yet reached the darkest point. For in order to demonstrate his devotion, he needed to offer something more, something valuable, something irreplaceable. Smoke rose thickly into the air, dancing between the flames of a fire that should never have been lit. The smell of burning flesh mingled with the incense from the altars, while the drums rumbled in a somber rhythm, drowning out any other sound. Ahaz was there, in the valley of Hinnom, in front of the statue of Molech, the bronze idol with its arms outstretched, as if waiting for a precious offering. The king of Judah, the descendant of David, the one who was supposed to protect his people, was about to do the unthinkable. The sacrifice had already been decided. It wouldn't just be gold or animals. It would no longer be a symbolic ritual to please foreign gods. What Ahaz would now hand over was the flesh and blood of his own son. The boy, too young to understand the fate that awaited him, was placed in the glowing arms of the statue where the flames slowly consumed him. There were no screams, as the drums were too loud. The people looked on, frightened and horrified, but no one dared to stop them. After all, it was the king who was there and who would rise up against him. Ahaz believed that this offer would make him stronger, that the pagan gods would give him power, protection, perhaps even the approval of the king of Assyria. But what he really did was open a wound in Judah that would never be forgotten. The Holy Land chosen by God was now marked by the blood of an innocent child, and this would not go unanswered. News of this sacrifice spread throughout the kingdom, reaching the ears of a man who spoke on behalf of God himself. Isaiah the prophet saw beyond the smoke. He saw what Ahaz refused to see. God was still in control. God still offered a way. But Ahaz, blinded by his own ambition, wouldn't listen. He was convinced that his faith was in the wrong altars, and nothing would change his mind. Silence fell over Jerusalem like a dense shadow. The people were still trying to understand how far Ahaz was willing to go. The sacrifice of his own son had been the definitive proof that he no longer served the God of Israel. But as he sank deeper and deeper into his idolatry, God was not silent. Isaiah the prophet appeared in the middle of the storm, carrying a message that did not come from the kings of the earth, but from the Creator himself. Isaiah stood before the king, firm and unwavering. He was not a warrior, nor did he have an army. His power did not come from swords or political alliances, but from words. And when he spoke, his voice pierced the air like thunder. Ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the depths of the earth or in the heights of heaven. But Ahaz, with a bitter smile, shook his head. He didn't want to listen. He didn't want a sign. The prophet knew why. Ahaz had already chosen his own path, his own security. The God of Israel was an inconvenient obstacle for someone who wanted to control his own destiny. But Isaiah didn't end there. If the king didn't ask for a sign, God himself would give one. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and he shall be called Emmanuel. The name hung in the air like something sacred. Emmanuel, God with us. A promise, a harbinger that the true king was yet to come, one who would not betray his people, who would not bow down to idols. But Ahaz didn't listen. His heart was already surrendered to another faith, and his feet were already walking down a path of no return. He returned to the temple, but not to seek God. When he crossed the sacred courts, his eyes no longer saw the glory of the Lord. In his mind, there was only one idea. If the Assyrian throne was the most powerful on earth, then the temple in Jerusalem should reflect that. The doors of the temple opened with a long, heavy creak. The place that had once been the heart of God's worship was now about to be desecrated at the hands of its own king. Ahaz walked through the courtyard, his eyes analyzing every detail, but not with reverence, with disdain. The temple seemed antiquated to him, a symbol of a past that no longer matched the new Judah he wanted to build. The God of Israel was a relic. The future belonged to Assyria, and Jerusalem had to bow to its influence. The priests watched, tense, not daring to protest as orders were given. The sacred altar, the one Moses had instructed according to God's own command, was moved, pushed aside as if it were just another worthless piece. In its place stood the new, immense altar, inspired by the one Ahaz had seen in Damascus, a pagan altar erected in the heart of the holy city. But that was only the beginning. Ahaz went through the temple with the coolness of a sculptor who decides to remodel his work. He had the bronze basins where the priests purified themselves before the sacrifices removed. He removed the gold supports and dismantled the structure of the courtyard. Even the entrance to the temple was modified so that it followed the standards of the king of Assyria. Each piece removed was a piece of Judah's identity that was lost. And then came the last decision, the most symbolic of all. Ahaz himself closed the doors of the temple. There would be no more sacrifices to the Lord, no more prayers before the altar of the covenant. The God of Israel was being removed from his own house, but Judah had not become stronger. On the contrary, as the temple fell silent, the kingdom crumbled. The enemies were no longer just outside the walls. The silence of the temple spread through Jerusalem like an invisible disease. The sound of prayers disappeared. The priests who had once risen at dawn to offer sacrifices now wandered without purpose, and Ahaz, sitting on his throne, realized something he hadn't expected. The peace he had so desperately sought had never come. He had given everything to Assyria. The gold from the temple, the tributes from the people, his devotion to foreign gods. And in the end, he received only crumbs. Tiglath-Pileser III was not an ally, he was not a protector. He was a cruel lord, and Judah was just another nation on its knees before him. Taxes were rising, the weight of servitude became unbearable. The people murmured in the alleys, cursing a king who bowed before other men, but never before God. But it wasn't just hunger and despair that were growing. Judah's borders, once protected by the Lord's promise, were now vulnerable. Philistines were taking cities in the south, Edomites were sacking villages. And Ahaz, the king who had forged alliances to protect his kingdom, found that he was more alone than ever. He became a puppet with no real throne, a prisoner within his own land. Ahaz's nights became long. He saw his own reflection in glasses of wine and saw there a different man than he imagined himself to be. The crown weighed more heavily every day. His hands were soiled with the blood of his own son, his mind consumed by voices that whispered that perhaps there was a way back. But he didn't listen, or perhaps he was afraid to listen. The years passed, and the disease caught up with him. His body weakened. His soul, long since lost, began to crumble along with him. But even on the brink of death, Ahaz did not seek the God of his ancestors. There was no more faith in his heart. Ahaz's breathing became weaker by the day. The palace, which had once been the scene of his ruthless decisions, was now just a gloomy room where a king died without honor. He no longer had the vigor of his early years, when he believed he could shape Judah's destiny with his own hands. Fever consumed his body, but it wasn't just illness that was eating away at him. The weight of his actions was crushing him from the inside out. Outside, the city he had ruled seemed to be moving on without him. The temple remained closed, the foreign altars still smoked, and the people no longer spoke his name with respect. The years of his reign were not remembered as times of glory, but of disgrace. Ahaz realized too late that Assyria, in whom he had trusted so much, had never been his salvation. The only thing he achieved with his alliances was the humiliation of seeing Judah reduced to a shadow of its former self. And then, like everything else in life, the end came. But unlike his predecessors, Ahaz was not buried with the kings of Judah. his own people refused to give him that honor. There was no weeping in the streets, no farewell songs, just a heavy silence and a broken kingdom, waiting for something, for someone, for a chance at redemption. And that chance would come. For the name that now echoed in the halls of the palace was no longer that of Ahaz, but that of his son, Hezekiah, the heir who carried the weight of a corrupt past, but who had before him the choice his father never made. Judah's fate was not yet sealed. There was still time to restore what had been lost. But to do so, Hezekiah would have to face the shadows that Ahaz had left behind and decide once and for all to whom the throne of Judah really belonged. Ahaz's name disappeared like ashes blown by the wind. His reign left no statues erected, no songs in his memory, only a trail of destruction, like footprints in the sand before the rising tide. But his story has not been forgotten. On the contrary, it became a warning, a distant echo that still resonates for those who dare to walk the same path. Ahaz had choices. From his first day on the throne, he was faced with two choices: to trust in the God of his ancestors or to bow down to the nations that seemed stronger. He chose the second option, believing that he could guarantee security on his own, trading his faith as if it were a bargaining chip. But what did he get? False protection, a reign marked by servitude, and an end without glory. His most fatal mistake was not just making alliances with Assyria or remodeling the temple, but turning his back on God and seeking power where there was no life. He gave his son to an idol that could never save him, closed the temple where he could have found redemption, and died without ever recognizing that the answer he had been looking for was right in front of him all along. But there is something curious about Ahaz's story. His son, Hezekiah, took the opposite path. While Ahaz closed the doors of the temple, Hezekiah reopened them. While his father turned Judah away from God, his son restored the nation's faith. This teaches us that the past need not define the future. We don't always carry the mistakes of those who came before us. Everyone has the power to choose whom they will serve. The story of Ahaz is a bitter reminder that trusting in the wrong forces leads to ruin, but it also teaches us that there is always a new beginning. There is always a chance to reopen doors that were once closed. If you enjoyed Ahaz's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.